intergovernmental procurement or piggybacking. And for me, I spent the last year creating this concept of the ABCs of piggybacking using cooperative purchasing. From my experience, I spent close to 5 years working at Department of Enterprise Services. And so I was part of a team that did statewide contracts for enterprise services. So cooperative purchasing has always been part of my life and something that, you know, I've seen it from both sides. Like I said, I've worked at DES. I've also been a user of cooperative contracts, whether it's a DES contract or a different provider out there. So I've seen it a couple different ways. And so I have some different thoughts about the things you have to consider on this. So I've tried to put it into 3 different categories to look at when you consider cooperative or piggybacking on a contract. And Mike brought up the point this morning about, you know, when you're going out for equipment, using a cooperative contract makes a lot of sense when it's something you're not going to go to market for a lot. And doing a bid costs money, right? So we think about time and money. And they're also, you know, time costs you too, right? So when you have time and money, you know, what's the best way to go to market, right? And leverage a resource. And so that's what really cooperative purchasing and piggybacking can do for you. But there's some things you have to consider before you do that. So piggybacking's purchasing products, you know, so you got products, services, and public works. So public works is part of cooperative purchasing too. So we're going to talk about that. So there's a distinction now when we talk about cooperative purchasing, because there's also a thing called a joint solicitation. So joint purchasing is not cooperative purchasing. And here's the distinction. I'm going to try to lay this out. So a lot of times you can do a joint purchase where I won conservation. I call it Mike's conservation district. Say, hey, Mike, why don't we both go put a solicitation together and leverage how much we're going to use and award a contract that we're both going to use. That's joint purchasing. Cooperative purchasing is, hey, I'm an entity. I'm going to award a contract. I don't know who's going to use it. So I'm going to put language in there that entities can use it. I think about it as like joint purchasing is like I'm going out to dinner with a friend. I already know who I'm going to go out to dinner with them. I already know what time we're meeting. I know what we're doing. Cooperative purchasing is, hey, I'm going to have this party. I'm going to have a guest list, amount of people that may join. I don't know who's going to show up to this thing. That's cooperative purchasing. So yeah, cooperative purchasing, the distinction is you're using someone else's contract, even though you weren't part of their solicitation process. And the thing about cooperative purchasing is when those suppliers bid on that, there's language in that contract that says, hey, there's no guarantee, one, that we're going to buy a certain amount, or even though we've opened it up for the world to use it, there's no guarantee anyone's even going to use this contract. So it's basically a contract out there that may be used someday. Now, of course, when you do cooperative purchasing, hope you put a good one together that someone may use, because that's the idea behind it. So the statute that allows you to do this is 39-34030. It's a joint powers agreement. Now, when you're purchasing from federal contracts, that's a separate statute. That's not part of this, but you are able to use federal contracts, but it's done separately. So just so you're aware of that, because they have their own federal contracting portfolio. And honestly, too, when you're using the state contracts through DES, they're under a different statute as well, but it's still considered cooperative purchasing. But really, this statute really allows you to utilize another entity's cooperative contract. So as a conservation district, I may do a contract and put a cooperative contracting provision in it that says, hey, this is going to be available for other conservation districts to use. I've done a cooperative purchasing agreement in that case. Or I'm a cooperative organization that's out there that's like, I'm just going to give you a couple that I'm aware of. Sourcewell, Omnia Partners. Those are those cooperative organizations that you could use under 39-34030. Now, there's some things that have changed in the last few years. That's why I say this is newish. That's changed in this piggybacking cooperative space. In 2019, what they changed in the language is they said, you can use the cooperative contract awarded through another public entity if they met their requirements to bid that. Because before that happened, you had to say it met your own. So that's something that's changed in the last few years. And so the other one's 39-34030. they better define what a nonprofit corporation is when you're using cooperatives. So they added some more language around refining what that meant. So today I'm going to talk about the three things about using piggybacking. You want to make sure the products or services are adaptable to the conservation district. The pricing and contract terms are beneficial for you to use it. And the contract award process is compliant with what you need to do to be able to have a contract in place with the provider. So let's start with adaptable first. What do we mean by that it needs to be adaptable? Well, the first thing you need to do is I've got this thing I want to buy. So the first thing I need to do is I found this contract I think I may use. I need to make sure it was awarded by a public agency. So how I know that is public agency is defined in statute. And it's defined as any agency of the United States, an Indian tribe recognized by the federal government, any political subdivision of another state. So that's an important piece to know. It can be from another state too. And there's an intricacy here when I talk about it's adaptable, it's got to be awarded by a public agency. So the award has to happen by a public agency. So what I mean by that is, even if you're using one of those national cooperatives, what you have to look at on that contract was there a public agency that ran that solicitation on behalf of that cooperative organization to award it? Because they're the one that have to run the solicitation process and make the award. Because that's important because they're supposed to follow their own competitive process for you to be able to use that contract. Yep, great. Great question. So her question was around like using a cooperative contract from an example like Omni Partners. I'd say probably 99% of the time when you think of one of those national cooperatives, they're using a public agency. I always point that out though, because there's so many different cooperatives out there. That's something you always just want to check for. How did that cooperative run that solicitation? Was it someone at that cooperative organization that's not a public agency? If so, you probably wouldn't want to use that, right? Because it's not a public agency that awarded and ran that solicitation. So that's in statute that it's got to be done as a public agency because they're supposed to have met their competitive requirements to bid that contract. So how you know is, so look at the cooperative portfolio, open the contract, and you want to see the solicitation that was done. Because in the solicitation, it's going to say this solicitation is done on behalf of cooperative and it's ran by whatever organization was responsible for that solicitation, because who put that solicitation out, who was questions going to, who actually did the formal award of that contract. So it's who was the person that did that contracting process. So we look at this contract that we find for our thing, and we want to make sure that the public agency that did this followed their competitive requirements to do this. So this should have been a competitively bid contract. So did they follow the requirements that they were supposed to follow within their own state or jurisdiction? Did they post that solicitation online somewhere? So why that's important is that's got to be posted somewhere where everyone in the world had that opportunity to bid on that solicitation. Now, a lot of people, what they'll do, we talk about posted online. So within our own state, we have the web system. That's the statewide system where the state's required to post those solicitations, but other entities can use it to post their competitive requirements. A lot of cooperatives, including the state, post through the web. So that's really how they're doing that online post. Even other cooperatives will do a notice posting in webs that says, hey, we're going out to market for this thing. Here's where you find it. So that's the posting it online somewhere, where it's accessible to anyone to bid on it. Yeah. Yep, that is a hard thing to find. Now there's a couple directories out there that you can get to that list cooperatives, and a lot of them are popping up all the time, but there's some pretty standard ones that are out there, like One of them's, State of Washington DES has a full contract portfolio out there you can get to, but there's a few other ones. I'm going to make a note. I can send you where you find, there's a few directories out there. I can point you to some to look at. But the important part of this, because they're popping up all the time, it's good to do this due diligence that we're discussing to make sure, because even just yesterday, I had an email from someone of a cooperative I'd never heard of before. Like there's new ones consistently, but there's some that have been well established for quite a while. A lot of the national ones, no, you wouldn't see that in there. Yeah, so using the RCW is not as beneficial, but that's a great question. I found too, I've looked online to see like cooperative contract for whatever it is, and I found some that way that I didn't know existed. But there's some standard ones I'd look at. I'll just give you some of the names. There's Sourcewell, there's Omnia Partners. They got the State of Washington contract portfolio that's out there. There's KCDA, which is a school district led cooperative, but a lot of other entities can use their contracting portfolio. So these are just a few that I'm aware of that are out there that you could decide to use. Now, oh, yes. Yep, great question. Now, what I've done in the past when I've used them, I'll go to that contract, and a lot of them will have an executive summary, like especially those bigger cooperatives. They'll have an executive summary of how the award process functioned. So I'm always looking to say, hey, a lot of times they'll say, this on behalf of, State of Oregon did this contract. They did this to award. They followed they'll walk through the process they followed, that they followed the solicitation process. And one of the things I've noticed, which they've updated recently, was on the state DES contracts. If you look at their contract portfolio now, they have a statement at the bottom that reads essentially that they ensure that this procurement meets 3926, follows the State of Washington current procurement policies, follows the procurement process, and they've determined that entering this contract would be the best interest of the State of Washington. So I was like, when I worked there, we never did that. And I followed up, I'm like, oh, wow, that's actually really makes it easy for people to be able to use your contracts, right? I wish all the entities did that. But so those ones now, when you go in there at the bottom, they actually have that statement. So that's important to know. Like for me, if I was using those contracts now, I'd print that page and put it in my file. Because I have heard from customers around the state that, as during audit time, people, they may get a question like, why'd you use this contract? Make sure it met the requirements. If you have that with you in your file, you can say, yep, see, I pulled the page up. Especially on those DES ones, right? I can show that the due diligence is there. They've met the requirements. I feel comfortable with those because they set the state policy for those awards. Now, the last part of this adaptable process is you need to make sure what you're looking for meets the specs and scope of that contract. So that's first step. Does what's in there meet exactly what I'm trying to do? Now, the fine line here is this. If the color of the thing I want may be different than what's in the contract, is a color option there? If so, I can still use it, right? So it's just overall, how's that thing, what's the form and function of this thing on this cooperative contract? Is it exactly what I'm going for? And if so, good space to use it. Now, the other piece to this, though, is that the last part of it is when you look at that thing, yes, the form and fits there. But that contract needs to have language that says it's intended to be a cooperative contract. So when that person put that solicitation out, they had to have some kind of language around it that says, this is a cooperative contract. Anyone can come to the party and buy off this thing. So if there's no language in there around that, on that agreement, you can't use it. And I can tell you, I've been disappointed times in my life when I thought I found this great contract, but they didn't put the language in where I could show up at the party and use it. Only if they would only knew I wanted to use it, but always make sure that the language in that you can piggyback. And so, and I'll call you in. The reason I say that is that's important because I think the intent there with that is those businesses have to know that's a potential opportunity that you may piggyback on it. So that's why it's important that they have to have the language in there for you to be able to do so. Yeah, so the question was around limits with using cooperative purchasing. So this is the great part about cooperative purchasing. There's no dollar limits. So in a way, it's almost like an exemption following your competitive process because it's allowable. So it's, and the reason that is because the competitive process has already occurred. So you don't have to run your own competitive process when using cooperative purchasing. So there's no dollar limit to when you can use it. Now, the only restriction is this. You have to make sure that contract is active for the time you're using it, right? So it's like the time I'm going to engage and use that contract, it's got to be available for me to use. Because once it expires, it no longer exists. That's one thing to watch out for. Because here's a scenario that can happen is, because you can use it for services, right? So I've got a cooperative contract I found to do services, which in my opinion, services are a great thing to do cooperative purchasing for. You've already leveraged collective buying power for services, which would be hard to get yourself. So I do a contract for 2 years for this service. My 2 years is up, but I had a year extension built into my contract. I want to go extend year 3. Oh wait, the cooperative contract's expired. Can't extend. It's not active anymore. It's not extendable at that point. So that's the thing you have to watch out for. Does that thing still exist where I can further my opportunity there? So the tip around this is a lot of people aren't aware that you can use it for public works, but there's some things you have to think about when you do. So the plans and specs from that awarding agency have to be really close to the same. The only difference should be the quantity purchasing. So roofing materials, one of those examples. There's some cooperatives out there for roofing products. So really, like if you've got services not addressed in that awarded contract, it's probably not one you can use because it's outside of the scope of what was awarded. So I've never used it for public works, but I think it would be more difficult to do it, but I've seen cases where people have, and like I said, roofing is one of those where I've seen people use it for like roofing contracts and things like that. Now, the thing to keep in mind too, if you're using it for public works, that does not get you out of the requirements for public works projects when that thing should have been a public works project. So still got prevailing wage, still got responsible bidder. They still have to be a responsible bidder in our state, meet all the requirements to be a registered contractor. And you've got your bonds and retainage still in place for those. So it's still a public works requirements to use those. And through the years, there's been some common questions that have come up around these. So I'm going to touch on a couple of those. And I touched, out of state contracts. I found a cooperative from state of California, state of Idaho. Can I consider those? And the answer is, yeah, you can, because as long as they're a public agency in those states, it's state of Idaho, state of Oregon, city of Miami Beach, as long as they're a government organization that's awarded that, you could consider using it. And the question I had touched on earlier, how do we know they're awarded and met the competitive requirements? Well, now they've got that great statement in there that helps us know that we should be safe using that. And now I touched on it a minute ago about how does the public agency part work when it's like a national cooperative? So it's a national cooperative, but it has to be awarded by a public agency. And that's where the good news is many of those cooperatives use the lead agency model concept and use a public agency to run the solicitation process. So that's the key word you're looking for. Even when you're talking to a cooperative, ask, do you use a lead agency, a lead government agency to do these procurements? If they say no, beware before buying off of it. And can you piggyback on a federal contract? You can. It's a different statute. There's a separate authority that allows you to use federal contracts. So beneficial. I figured out this contract can adapt to the thing I want to get. Does it benefit me? There's 3 main components I look at to whether I'm going to use a cooperative contract. when I think of savings, does it save me time? Do I have to go to market myself for this? There's a savings. Is the cost comparable to what I think I can get on the market? So if I can save time, there's some cost savings, even if the cost is comparable. It may make sense for me to use this. And does the scope align with what I'm hoping to go with? Is the scope there to where it covers all my needs, where I don't have to go out and still have to break apart what I'm going out to market for? Those three things connect, but the point I want to make here out of these three things, one may mean more to you than the other. Here's the example. If I look at time, cost, and scope, depending what I'm going to market for my thing, the time may be the most important thing. Because while I could have maybe saved more in cost if I went to market myself, if I've got grant funds that I've got to use within the next 3 weeks, it may not make sense. I don't have the time to go out myself and leverage more cost savings than I see on that cooperative. So maybe time's the bigger value for me in this case where I may use cooperative purchasing. So I'm saying that one of them doesn't outweigh the other and one may mean more, right? But I've also seen if my biggest factor is cost, you can save money on cooperative purchasing. Now, and where I personally have seen cost be very valuable here, in products, yes, but services, you can save a lot of money by using cooperative purchasing because what you're doing is using the collective buying power of all those organizations that are going to use that service contract. So you don't have to try to negotiate and go out to market for a service that multiple other entities are already using. So when I talk about services, the example I'd share is that we had our own agreement in India I worked at for a laundry service. And we had it in place for about 5-6 years. And so the person managing that contract started testing the marketplace and said, you know, when this thing comes up, we may want to rebid it because I think the pricing has gone down on this service. But I also knew there was a state contract for this service. So I said, wait, before we go out to bid, go look at that state pricing because they leveraged like all these different state agencies that wanted the same service. Go look at what the costs are. He took a look and called me back the next day. He said, well, we're already going to save $10,000 a year just with what's in that pricing for that statewide contract. So we didn't go to market. Like we were already saving money because we could leverage that collective buying power because cost was the most important thing to him at that time. So time, cost, and scope can weigh more than the others based on what you're trying to do and using cooperative purchasing as a tool, because that's really what this is. It's a tool based on going out to market yourself. The other benefit to this tool is it can be a utilization opportunity for small and diverse businesses as well. So where I've seen success with this is look at these contracts when you're intending to use them. See if they have authorized resellers. If they have a list of authorized resellers, ask that provider, hey, you know what? Diverse businesses are important to me. I see your list of authorized resellers. If you haven't identified them on this contract list already, can you tell me, are any of them certified in our state as a small business or a minority-owned business? Let me know, because if I have a choice of which local reseller I'm going to use, that may be an opportunity to leverage some diversity. An example I've used in my own lifetime is we implemented a copier contract and also a managed print contract. And so when we went to that contract, like on the state of Washington contracts, a lot of their contracts identify who those certified businesses are for those categories, whether they hold state certifications. And while we could have picked a bunch of different resellers for our copier needs, we selected a small business that was in that, manufacturer list. So we could have that small business have that opportunity. So there's different ways you can think about using this as another tool for you to meet some other needs that you may have. The other one that was asked the other day, which is a great one from a customer, was, I see what's on this cooperative list. They called me up and said they'd give me another discount. Can I accept it? Oh, heck yes. If they're going to give me better pricing, by all means, give me better pricing than what you're offering on the list. Because what happens sometimes is they'll have a special time offer where they'll give you another % off. That does happen. And here's the great part. Here's the thing. That's a cooperative contract, right? It was already competitively bid. So they've already said what the ceiling price is. If they want to go below that, by all means, please do. Now, on the flip side of that, I've had a phone call where it's like, I'm looking at this cooperative contract I'm on the fence. I can go to market for it. And it actually costs more on this cooperative list than what I already looked online I could go buy it for. What do you think's going on there? Well, here's why. A lot of these cooperatives, think about if you don't know who's coming to the party, right? So if I have a contract that may be used either all over the state or by multiple states, I have to put in pricing and terms that's going to account for everyone. So let's say it's a furniture delivery contract. I got to deliver furniture to all 50 states for that business, that vendor, right? They're going to have to put in pricing. And let's say I have next day delivery anywhere in the United States for this furniture contract. They're going to, they're going to build on that pricing to factor in those delivery costs, right? So why I give that example is you actually may sometimes be able to leverage better pricing based on your needs and the scope of what you have in your contract terms and conditions, right? So I use furniture as an example because you may have a local supplier, like if you do chair fittings and things like that, it may be more beneficial to go source that one yourself than use a cooperative, right? Because if my needs and my terms and conditions are a little different than what's on that cooperative, there might be a price difference because those contractors are pricing the risk, right? That you have those contracts in place. So that's where if cost is your factor there, which one do you use? Last part of this, compliant. So to be compliant, you have to make sure if I'm ever audited, what are all the steps I have to have in place? Well, very first thing, if you're going to use one of these cooperatives, you got to have an agreement that you're using that cooperative before you use it. So you got to have that agreement in place. So if it's just another local government entity, so I've got a conservation district contract, I put some cooperative language in, Mike wants to use it, he's got to have an interlocal with me that he's going to use my contract. Got to have that done first. State of Washington, they have a master contract usage agreement, sign it once, it's active forever. And if you haven't used enterprise services contracts, high probability is at one point in time, your conservation district probably has. So if you're curious whether you've got an agreement or not, they have a page that has those there. You can go up and see, hey, have we already signed that? And if you're using one of those national or state cooperatives, their cooperative agreement basically suffices as that interlocal agreement that you need to have in place. So basically in those national cooperatives, you got to sign up first before you start buying off of them. So I talked a little bit about extensions early on. So this is my tip for you. You want to make sure your contract extensions don't exceed the life of that contract you intend to piggyback off of. So before you put that agreement in place, look at how long that contract's going to run. So if you got a contract, you run it for 2 initial years, and then you have a third option. If you're looking to extend and that contract's still active, great with the extension, go ahead. But if that 2 initial years is over and that contract now is not there, can't do the extension. There's no contract to extend off of. One that comes up a lot too is, are you compliant with federal funding if you're piggybacking? So yes, piggybacking is an option you can consider on federal funding. So they actually, the CFR is right here of what's required when you do that. Now, sometimes as well, when you're using federal funding, the certain grant that you're using may have some restrictions. So it's always good to ask. In general, you can use them, but if it's a certain grant from the feds, you may want to just find out if there are any restrictions, if any. I haven't heard of a lot of cases where there is, but there are some, depending on what you're going to market for. Now, one thing I'm going to touch on too, I didn't cover as much today about it, but there's a couple of considerations when we talk about goods, services, and piggybacking, where we've got some federal considerations to have. One of the things that's going to go active here at the end of May is we're going to update our contract requirement tool. So when you go pull up a conservation district for, what's my needs, and yours are going to say, well, you get to set it in policy essentially. But here's the other cool part about it though. It's going to happen. Even though it says that, you already know to anticipate that. There's going to be a new piece on there that talks about federal funding considerations based on that project type. MRSC's been working with a state auditor in this last year to enhance that tool, to add in those federal contracting requirements and things to think about based on your project types. So we're intending to have federal language to consider both for your equipment, services, and public works projects. So that's we actually have that in beta testing right now, and we're planning on rolling that out into the tool very shortly. So just a good thing to be aware of. So those are the three things I want you to think about, just remembering those ABCs. You want to make sure products and services are adaptable to what you're intending to do. The pricing and the terms are a real benefit for you. And the contract award process is compliant with all the things you need to do for audit intensive purposes. So those are you do all those three things. This is a great tool. So as reference, early on, I'm a procurement geek, and I love this topic so much. Earlier in the year, I wrote a blog post about this very thing. So this training's an expansion of that blog post, because I was like, this just seems to be a big need. People really need to know what a great tool this is. But have fully understanding how to use that tool properly. So that's the blog post I wrote, just because I know people need to see this information multiple different ways too. So I've outlined these things I showed you today as an article, laying these out as well. And then we have a topic page around this. And the thing that's not here, because I haven't finished it yet, I'm going to do a webinar of this same material again and cover it, but do it statewide, so other people may have other questions around it. So I'm going to cover this topic again as a webinar as well. Cooperative purchasing questions. Okay, a couple, great. On the mic, and we'll cover those. Yeah, and then one of the things I pointed out too is that as an entity, you can write your contracts to be available as a piggybacking opportunity as a local entity. Now, in general, the entities I see doing this, I see some cities and counties doing that sometimes, because there are some pieces you have to consider. It's like, if I'm going to put language in here to do it, is this contract really scoped enough to offer it to anybody? So those are kind of the considerations. So I said, typically cities and counties will do that, but they'll say, hey, I've got this contract. I'm just going to put some interlocal language in here that, hey, someone else can jump onto this contract if they so wish. Great topic. And I'd like to connect with you later, because one of the things I've been working on in the last year is there's actually a requirement now in statute that cities and counties have passed ordinances to do sustainable composting and organics purchasing. And so I've always thought it'd be great if we could come up with a contract that had those type of products on that, so that anybody could buy, composting that met those requirements. Yep. Yep, I can see that being a need, because like I said, I think local organizations, like when they have to go get this organic composting, they're gonna have to try to figure out how do they make sure that product meets that requirement. You have to go do it as a one-off thing for every project at this point. So yeah, it's a great point. Looking at those needs of where you want to do cooperative purchasing, what are the type of things that are unique that you want to build a overall contract portfolio for? That is a great question, because I see the fine line. I said another fine line one, because you've got the AmeriCorps, which could you argue it's a state government, but it may not be, because are they not, what kind of entity are they? That's another one. Like I said, any of these fine line ones I'll have to look into a little bit more. Now, I seem to recall just some research I've done on some other projects. I think MRC has done some research on that one in the past. So let me look in and see what I have on that one. Huh. Right. Right. Yeah, so the question was, what if you're using correctional industries work crews? Yeah, my initial thought is, no, it's not prevailing wage, because it's an agency to agency contract. I think there is a distinction though on the AmeriCorps one, but I think you'd be okay on this correctional industries, because it's state agency, the government agency, but I'll follow up on the AmeriCorps one. That's a good one. Well, I think on something like that, you possibly would want to bid it because there's multiple providers that say Microsoft products. Now, I'll give you the one caveat with that. The advantages of cooperative purchasing sometimes is how much risk will you have covering it yourself? Like, will you be able to think of all the considerations? Because you may want to source it yourself and contract separately to make sure you cover all of your requirements you may need to make sure it's compliant, data security, all those pieces. So stuff like software, how proprietary is it? And will you be able to cover all your risk by going out independently for it? So I think that to circle back to your question, I think, yes, you could source yourself. And for something like that, like Microsoft, I think you still could find multiple providers that could provide that service because they have multiple resellers. So your pricing may change based on who can offer you the best pricing for your service need. So if there's not any more questions, what I'd like to do is take a little break before we get to our last portion here. So it's a little after 3 right now. Why don't we come back at 3:10, take a little break, get up and stretch, and we'll do our last section. The official title of this is the Exemptions to Competitive Bidding, but technically